Good morning.
Good morning.
I was hoping someone would respond. I wanted to make sure my audio was working. Thank you.
Totally understand.
We also need some note takers. And Aaron, if you can get us started, would be great.
Sure thing. Good morning, everybody. It'd be great if someone could volunteer to take notes. There is a little note-taking tool inside of this meeting software. You should find it with a little pencil icon. Can we get at least one volunteer? All you have to do is just, yes, thanks Nancy for the link. Roughly take notes on what people are presenting, and especially more importantly than the presentation content is any of the replies that people and the discussion that happens here.
We really can't begin the session unless we have at least one volunteer.
I volunteer.
Thank you very much. Go
Was
ahead,
that Joel?
and that was Joel, yeah.
Thanks.
You should be able to just click the little edit link in that at the link Nancy sent and sign in with your data tracker. All right. So thank you, Joel, for that. Quick intro to the agenda. You should be able to find the agenda link in this software as well, or it's in the notes document actually. And we have a couple of drafts to cover today, so hopefully we'll hear from everybody who has updates on their drafts. Starting with Pamela, we have Pamela first on the agenda, but I don't see her in the participant list here. So we may have to bump her to later. Hopefully she shows up shortly. So I only got one set of slides emailed to me ahead of time, but again, sorry for the short notice of sending out the request for them. If you have slides that you want to present, you can share your screen through this, that's fine. Or if you want, you could also email them to me right now and I can upload them. Danny says Pam is joining now. Great. In that case, let's let Pam start once she gets here.
Is there a chat feature in the software here? If there is, how do I get
There
to
is,
for it?
yeah. On the left column, there's the little list of all the people, and there's a separate tab kind of next to that with little chat bubbles, and that'll switch the participant list into the chat view.
Yeah, so Matt, you might see two little bubbles above the participant list. That's the chat panel.
I do not see the bubbles above the participants list.
Yeah, this is interesting. How did you join, Matt? Because I cannot chat with you either. So it looks like,
I just joined using the link and signed in with the data tracker credentials. Went through the front door, I think, but I'll just look at the notes, and if there's anything that's important that happens in chat, I'm just hoping maybe to see some questions if people have them and answer them if they don't want to say them out loud or can't because they don't have a mic or something like that.
Yeah, I'll be sure to repeat anything that comes in the chat so
Okay,
that
thank
we
you.
can all hear it. There is one other way to get to the chat, which is if you go to the it's called Zulip, so it's zulip.ietf.org, and they've now integrated that with this meeting tool. So there is a SCIM room there, and it's the same as the one for this meeting. It's a little bit hard to find it, but hopefully you can get in that way too. Okay, Pamela is here. Fantastic.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, you can. Oh, good. I was about to panic. Okay, so use cases. Are we, and I think I have 25 minutes, right? But I'm happy to keep it shorter to make sure we're still on agenda here.
Sure thing. I will just make sure to cut you off after 25 minutes if you're not already done.
That's right. Just cane me off. All right. Let me share my screen. So the quick, wow, is it? Well, I guess we're going to find it. Window. Yeah. All right. That works. So the quick update here on the use cases is I have been going through the specs and looking for the terms that are heavily used in RFC 76, 43, and 44.
Wait, sorry, Pamela, are you sharing your screen?
I'm not. I just thought I'd give a quick
okay.
a quick update first.
Got it.
So I've been going through to try to find the terms because in some sense, if we can use the terms in the spec within the use cases, I think that's probably the best way to get people who are reading the use cases sort of into the spirit of using these terms in context so that when they read the spec, they can understand what's happening. And so what I ended up doing is going down a rat hole of interesting proportions. So let me share the picture that I'm drawing, and what I need is your guidance here on where the rat hole should end. Come on. Permission denied by system is what it's saying right now. Do we know if that's my system or your system?
I think that means it's yours. I think is your browser granted permission to
Yeah, hold on. Well, that was, a bit of a denouement. All right, fine.
I just gave you control, so you should be able to share.
Huh. Perfect. So it'll only let me share the deck that's in the queue, the cursor-based pagination deck. So I'm not sure that's going to help me.
Right, that's because your slides were not uploaded on the data tracker, but there should be a way for you to share your screen.
Yeah, just a second. I'm going to try the entire screen just to see if that's going to work. Yeah, I'm still getting an error. Is there someone, Danny, are you online? Maybe I can share this with you very quickly. It's really just one slide, so we're not talking about a rocket science experiment here. But it is fairly important for my point and to get the feedback that I need. Just a second. Danny, are you there? Can I share it with you and see if you can share it?
Yeah.
All right, hold on. All right, well, let me give you the conundrum I'm in right now, and then you can, I think we can probably get this going even without the picture. In fact, let's just do it without the picture because I don't want to waste everyone's time. I've also lost you all. Hold on. There we are. So I will get Danny to send the picture in a second, but the issue that I'm having right now is on external ID and treatment of external ID. So what the specifications define is a provisioning domain, right? And that provisioning domain is affiliated to the client, right? So there's a provisioning domain, and if you look through the specs, there's the provisioning client, right? Either pushes or pulls into the provisioning domain, right? Pushes to the provisioning domain or, pushes out of the provisioning domain or pulls into the provisioning domain. Now, what isn't clear in the specs as far as I can interpret them is exactly what happens in the case of different clients in different provisioning domains. So the client, the external ID is defined as being relative, right? And defined only to the scope of a given provisioning domain. And so the question that I have for you that maybe you guys can weigh in on while I share this with Danny is in the case where the provisioning client is pushing a new resource to the SCIM server, right? They have a chance to specify that the external ID, right? And as long as the server agrees that that external ID is not a collision, then generally speaking, the SCIM server will accept it, but they may return back a 201, right? With a differentiating external ID. So that piece is well defined in the spec. What is not well defined is that if you now have a client in a separate provisioning domain that wants to access that same resource, we know we have an external ID that is scoped to the provisioning domain, but the provisioning domain has, this is perhaps the first time the client in the new provisioning domain has ever accessed the resource. So the question becomes, what is the external ID that gets returned? Does that make sense?
I can answer that.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's Phil Hunt here. So this goes back to one of the issues you have in writing standards, and that the primary focus always when you read a spec is what's the interop issue, and giving implementers the flexibility to do things how they want. So there wasn't a consensus on describing the entire procedure for this. So that's why it's not all there. And that's because some people will want to do something sophisticated and some people will want to do this trivially. So what the contract is really saying is that the client that sets an external ID entity can keep using that external ID to reference that object. And that takes some pressure off, because then the client doesn't have to remember all the SCIM identifiers, which are permanent. So the contract is between the client and the server. So what a server implementer could do then is bind the client credential or client subject to that external ID, so that client A asks the question, client B can use a different identifier if it so chooses. Now that is not exposed. You can't list the multiple external identifiers. Each client then sees its own. Another implementer can say there can be one and one only. It's up to the implementer or the design of their system underneath as to what the overall capability is. And so the spec by intention was silent on that matter. So what should be happening is if a client is trying to contact SCIM in another domain, it should always be able to use that external identifier. But that doesn't mean that another client from yet another domain would see the same identifiers. I don't think it's the greatest solution, but that's the solution the group chose.
Okay, so for those of you who have implementations, right? If I do, I mean, I did share, Danny, I did share the slide with you so that you can put it up, just so that we have some kind of reference, right, for the conversation. But here's the question. So if I am a new client accessing, I didn't create the resource, so I never negotiated that external ID interaction, right? Or the binding essentially between the SCIM server and the client, then do I get no external ID back? So now finally, thank you so much, Danny. I'm so sorry, you all. So if you're going to create the resource, then the negotiation of the external ID, right, with provisioning domain A here on the left-hand side is very straightforward, right? So the question is, if you're going to query the resource on the right-hand side, then are you going to get an external ID back at all? What is the expectation for the implementer? And is there a way for that implementer, that second client, to negotiate an external ID so that it does have its own external handle, or is expected to use the SCIM server's ID?
It's only specified that if the same client asked it back, it would get back the external ID. It's up to the implementer of the service to decide whether they're binding it to the client specifically or to the entire object. It's silent on that matter. So you can't count on it if you're doing a multi-client system. That's the downside. What you can count on is that the URI for a SCIM object never ever changes. And you can calculate the URI because the identifier also never changes. So you can share that identifier between multiple clients. That's always guaranteed to be stable. So it's unlike a graph API, SCIM identifiers are permanent. And this is why we're into the delete and resurrection discussion. Because identifiers are permanent, we want them to survive deletion and resurrection as well. So that's the strongest part. And I think it's what most people are using. When they have to maintain that relationship, they'll store the SCIM identifier locally or the whole SCIM URI. The identifier is actually better, in my opinion, because even over time, the domain name for the server might change more often than the SCIM identifier does. So the identifier is the permanent identifier that you can always count on. Still, there were people who said, I can't store anything in my client. It's a limited capability client or whatever. It just wants to use a key that it's got, which might be a user ID or something. So I don't know that, and this is totally unscientific, but my experience is that for all the reasons you described, external ID is not actually used that often. And that was no surprise to me.
I would second that, Phil. We in our many implementations of SCIM, external ID was one of the most confusing things and difficult to implement because it didn't add a lot of utility to the clients. And the patterns that developers were used to following was that when creating a resource, it was the server that would allocate the ID, and then the client would just remember that ID if it needed to be referenced in the future. And so we just didn't implement external ID for this reason that we're talking about. It didn't add a lot of utility for the client, and it was very confusing on the server side, especially trying to bind an ID to client credentials. Turned out to be a lot of overhead on the service side.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this something then that, to me, if it's a very confusing concept, and I think we should try to communicate it in the use cases and concepts piece so that people at least understand that piece. Is there ever a case where an external ID can be negotiated for a client that did not create the resource? Because that seems like the only possibility here. I've also never heard of a SCIM server managing different external IDs per client, but that seems to be that's the implication of the standard.
Well, I think as Matt said, and in my experience, external ID is really a fail-safe connector. It's not what clients use. They use the permanent URI. That's
Right.
the way it's done. And part of the simplification is to do that. I want to sort of alert you to, there's another parallel group that went through this, and that's the OpenID Foundation and Shared Signals. One of the problems they went is they rolled out with OpenID without specifying in the contract how to reference objects over time, so that you create a single sign-on, you create a sign-on assertion, and that OAuth, that JOT token flows through the system to the downstream client web server that then establishes its own session. But the session at the client web server is completely independent of the OpenID provider. And one of the things they forgot to say is, if I talk about this object ever in the future, here's the common identifier between the two. So Google talked about this publicly, so I'll comment. I mean, they said, you know, they have 100,000 at the time. So this was 8 years ago, 9 years ago. They have over 100,000 active clients against the Google IDP. Not one of them, there's no standards, can do it. So if Google said this token is revoked or this session is revoked, the clients are tracking it a completely different way. So all that to say, there was this strong need to have agreement on identifiers. What started then was in the shared signal community, they started the subject identifier drafts, so that in addition to specifying a subject, you could specify a subject in different ways. It became very quickly, and I don't mean to be derogatory, it became spaghetti on the wall, where I'll throw out every identifier I know for the subject, and hopefully you understand one of them. And so they created a spec so you could do that. That was one of the ways, one of the use cases behind the subject identifier draft. And that's useful, but it's also scary. It's because you didn't establish the standard at the outset. The whole thing blows up. So everybody's trying.
Lost Bill. I think we lost Bill.
Oops. Okay, does anyone else have
I-
comments on this? Because I think that,
Yeah, Danny.
I mean, go ahead, Matt.
I see Danny on the queue.
Hey, yeah, so in my experience, so I guess there's two parts there, although I raised my hand originally when it was just one. So to the question of different clients negotiating like different external IDs, I've never seen that sort of in the major SaaS implementations out there. And I've actually seen external ID be leveraged fairly frequently for sort of, you know, larger enterprise applications using SCIM, where there's an expectation that like the SCIM management is probably coming from an organization's connected IDP, and specifically for scenarios where maybe like a migration from one IDP to another is happening. IDP being identity provider. Anyway, I don't want to cause confusion with any acronyms. But if you're moving from identity provider A to B, it may be that your different systems have different, you know, we'll call them friendly names, you know, things like email address, a username type thing, where you don't have the right information to match on that, but that external ID may be something that you can leverage and it's been pre-populated. You know, knowing that your, you know, for your first IDP gave it such and such internal identifier, and you can then port that over and leverage that as sort of that. I do agree, it's a fail-safe mechanism for identifying or matching, you know, an object. So yeah, I've never seen like different clients return different external IDs as something that anybody has implemented. I've always seen it as just sort of a straight string. But I do see value in it, and I think I see it implemented probably more than some of the other folks. And I'll lower my hand now.
Okay. I mean, I feel like we could do a revisionist approach to external ID to state that there's two use cases where it's used. I mean, if there's ever a document to put that in, right, we can talk about the enterprise IDP use case and the migration use case. and say this, external ID is where this is valuable. And it does seem to be about really, like you said, is a fail-safe during initial creation of the objects, right? Whether that's creation of the object for migration or creation of a very long-term, very authoritative relationship between an enterprise IDP and a data store. Does anyone have heartburn if we at least try that in draft format?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is the one thing from Okta. I think we see the use cases where, at least not necessarily in the scheme content, but we see cases where a user profile gets populated from multiple data sources, and each data source actually identifies that particular identity use different external IDs. In that particular case, the identity, like external ID, is not stored necessarily in the central scheme profile, but it's kept from on the per data source basis, and that mapping exists to allocate the client or different, like a client from different data sources to essentially identify the users in their system easier. So.
We didn't see you on the queue, but I see Danny Mayer on the queue. So Danny, I don't know if you had a comment. Okay, and then Phil.
I implemented this on a internal organization, and basically the organization did have a unique ID always. So it didn't matter that the number, how many SCIM clients we had, the external ID would be always the same. And we had an IDP involved as well as HR systems. So they all shared that one ID. But you can only do this really within a single ecosystem. If you have multiple ecosystems, then you have a whole different ballgame, and then you have to figure out how to integrate that. And that's going to be a hard sell.
Okay, yeah, that's the dilemma I have right now, is how we characterize this in the way that people are actually using it. Like, it sounds to me like there's a sort of a split, right? There are at least, so it sounds like Okta is using external ID more faithfully, I would say, to at least how it's explained in the spec than others, because the others just haven't had the need for it. Okay, I know I'm going to get caned off here, so I will try and summarize this and mail it to the list so that others can weigh in, and I may take a survey, if that's okay, Nancy, on the list.
Yeah, that would be great. And then if you can upload the slide to the meeting materials. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have Danny and Matt. Which of you is going to present, or both? And I believe I've already loaded for this.
This is Matt. I'll present to these slides. So I'm trying to think, how do I advance the slides here?
I have to give you the control. You should see the controls in a second now.
Okay. All right, I see them.
Do you see the little numbers along the bottom now?
All right,
yeah,
thank
great.
you. Yeah, so I guess the first thing to mention is that currently the only draft that's published is the first revision. And there's a second revision underway that addresses an ambiguity that was brought up on the list, and I'll get to that in a minute. So unfortunately, prior to this meeting, we did not have a chance to upload the latest draft, but it's very similar to the first one. It just has a few wording changes and addresses the ambiguity. Let me just go through really quickly and talk about the reason for the draft. The draft was born out of multiple implementations, service provider implementations, in front of many different application APIs and databases. And what we found as we implemented SCIM service providers is that the pagination strategy was already defined in existing code bases that we were writing SCIM implementations on top of. If we were writing on top of an API that already supported index offset pagination, then it was a very easy implementation for us. But if our underlying database or our underlying API supported only cursor-based pagination, it was really difficult to implement indexed pagination on top of that. So, it's a really easy diagram to visualize this is that, you've got your typical applications kind of on the right-hand side of this slide, where there's a web API usually, or a database that's sitting on top of either a directory API or a database API, and then you're building your SCIM service provider either directly to the web API that's already existing, or you're reaching underneath and talking to the database layer. And the pagination strategy is already established. You don't really have the opportunity as a SCIM service provider to go back and change any code in the application to make it easier for you to implement index pagination. And so we needed to have a way of implementing cursor pagination. And that's really what the spec is about, or the draft. It's just a proposal for cursor-based pagination. And when we, kind of got together as an interest group, as prior to recharting the work group, Phil and I put our heads together, and we just, we tried to think about what are the scenarios where pagination is important. And, it's obviously when there's going to be large result sets. And it turns out the most common use case for this is a client requesting all of the resources for users or for groups, so that they could maintain a kind of a local cache of the information that was on the service provider. And this actually happened to be our use case most of the time when we were retrieving large data sets, was to get the initial load of users or groups onto the client, and then the client would periodically make queries to the service provider to keep its local cache up to date. And this is a very typical scenario for identity management systems, is to have a local representation of all of the identities, including all of those that come from SCIM service providers, so that identity management tasks can be accomplished. And so we kind of proposed a question, which is that if all we really need is the ability to kind of keep a client and a server up to date, in sync with each other, do we need pagination, or can we just get away with having some kind of a change notification, which I think Phil will talk about. And we proposed that to the interest group, and the response back, as I remember it, I don't have the notes to prove this, but I remember distinctly many people having continued interest in pagination in spite of also having the ability to do change notification. And so what Danny and I will be saying in submitting this draft is that if we need pagination in SCIM, we need to have some interoperability for cursor pagination. As an overview, there's just new query parameters. The count query parameter isn't actually new. It's just the cursor query parameter, and it's pretty simple in terms of the response as well. There's a next cursor and a previous cursor in a response, which ends up looking a little bit like this, where you've gone ahead and asked for a resource, specified that you want cursor pagination, you get a next cursor in your response, which you can include in the subsequent request to get the next page. So I don't want to go through all of the draft in slide form, but it's a very simple proposal. And like I mentioned earlier, it's very similar to the original proposal. What we'll have in the next revision is just a few wording changes and some grammar punctuations that were in the original draft. Fix some of that stuff. And then there was an ambiguity that was discovered and pointed out on the list about, what do I do as a service provider if I support both cursor and index pagination? If the cursor parameter is optional, which is what the original draft specified, And there is an ambiguity there, and we resolve that by just simply making the cursor query parameter mandatory. And if you want the first page, you just supply an empty cursor. And that was the way that WSO2 ended up implementing it, and it worked great for them. So that solved that ambiguity, and we just put it in the draft. So that's really all I have on the slides, and I'm happy to take any questions or concerns about the draft, or maybe additions that we could make, and put them in.
Danny, you're in the queue.
Yeah, Danny, go ahead.
I just want to mention that one of the other issues is even if you do change notification, you may find that you need to submit the change set and do some sort of cursor or count notification.
I think we lost a word there. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, I didn't get that.
If you are doing the change set notification, the change set may be large, so you may need to do cursor or based change sets.
That's true. Yeah, you might need pagination if the change set was large. Yes.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, Philip?
I'm a little confused. In the event notification, events are always per object. There's no set mode.
Well,
Matt,
Phil, so you're saying that if changes were per object, that you would never need pagination because you're only getting a notification on a single object change, that there would never be a kind of a batch of changes that you would receive as a client, right?
yeah, in fact, it's
Except-
impossible.
Okay.
at all.
The only place where it may get complex is a group, which is why we have a minimum profile where you might not want to send all of the change data in a group, or you might not want to send an event for every change to a group. So you may say the group has changed, and then the client has to go pull that group to get its current state.
Right.
The larger a
Well-
group gets, the more often it changes. So it's the opposite. You'll get a reduced numbers of changes, or the asserting party may aggregate changes to a single object, but you'll never get multiple objects in a single event. That's not even allowed by set.
Okay. So Danny's concern isn't an issue then, is basically what you're saying.
No.
Okay. Yeah, I think that one of the concerns, although it wasn't spoken when we had the meeting of interested people, was that what if, even in the light of an upcoming change notification mechanism, what if a client didn't want to implement that and they want to just kind of go old school and just submit a query? Can I please have pagination? I feel like there was still some interest in pagination in spite of having change notification.
Yeah, and I'm still confused because so one of the trigger issues is the max results limit, which is not a mandatory thing. It's just that servers are allowed to assert it. But if you are paginating, that wouldn't solve your max results, because if you're only allowed 1,000 results in a query, the fact that you pulled it back in 10 pages doesn't let you break through max results. If that's a security breach. So the objective is to download all of the data. If you're doing that, then you're far better for both sides to download it in one call and stream it to disk, assuming that the service provider gives you permission to go over that max results, because you're a privileged client, you're allowed to do that. And that's fine. That's allowed within the spec. And you don't need to do this. And the reason I say this is because everything I'm looking at with cursor-based paging is that it's meant for a small subset. And when you look at products like Microsoft SQL Server, they do this in virtual memory. So while it works, if you try to lock up the entire set, you're asking the server to store all that data in virtual memory. And if you look at Stack Overflow, you'll see thousands of reports of thrashing that starts occurring on SQL Server. And that's why I say it opens the door for a denial of service attack, because you only need one or two clients to make that call. And if they're allowed to make that call, you run out of memory on your server, and you could take out an entire cluster. The other problem is that some
Hang on,
servers can
Philip.
do
Can
this
you?
while they're backed by a directory, by a database. But if you have a highly sharded system or an API that is not backed by a database, but by some intermediary system, implementing cursors may be impossible. So if people are doing this to support coordinated provisioning and synchronization, you're getting at something that may only address half the possible SCIM implementations out there. So I think you can argue cursor-based paging is useful for other reasons, and I could support that. My concern is that a lot of systems are not doing monolithic architectures where we're talking about a SCIM directory sitting on top of a database. That's not even SCIM's window. SCIM is a provisioning API only. It's not meant to act like a database to do this kind of functionality.
Okay, Philip. I would like to hear from other folks about the particular point, about whether the idea is that the cursors are in fact tied to the database mechanism, or if it's possible to implement it in other non-relational database systems or without making a copy in memory. Does anybody have any experience there to share?
I think I
So the
can
queue,
answer some
sorry
of
for
that.
the let's ignore the queue really quick, because I think those comments were a different topic.
Yeah, I'll just mention that you know, in our case, in implementing multiple service providers, we just simply reuse the cursor from the underlying API or database. If it wasn't, you know, we didn't, and there always is a mechanism by which you can page results, and we did not have to implement any kind of cursor implementation within the SIM service provider itself. And I don't know if our experience in 35 you know, SCIM service providers is perfect, but it obviously isn't. But it did end up being a very useful thing for us not to have to do translation from cursor-based to index-based. Because in trying to translate from cursor-based to index-based, which by the way is the only pagination style that you can use by the current spec, then you do have to keep full result sets in the service provider, which brings up the problem that Phil was mentioning, is that even implementing index pagination on top of a cursor-based pagination code base, you can deplete the memory very quickly in a service provider. So that was our main reason in needing to do cursors, is to match the underlying code base so that we didn't have to have a lot of memory in the service provider.
Okay, great.
And I'll just mention one thing in closing, in rebuttal to Phil. A lot of the concerns about cursor pagination that Phil brings up, I believe, are also applicable to index. You know, they're the same, really, when you get under the covers in terms of your liability in implementing them. And there are reams of information about how this can be done, and protect yourself from the possible memory depletion attacks that we're concerned about.
Great, thanks. Either Danny, are you in the queue for this topic?
Yeah, I'd like to say that I agree with Matt on that. The just pulling everyone into memory just to serve it up can be a real problem. You have 100,000 employees, you're going to have a problem getting all the data that you need into memory that you can then serve up. I wouldn't like to try it, but we shouldn't be dependent on the translation between server or indexing and how things operate behind the scenes. I think that's sort of off topic, really. We can't answer that.
Okay, Danny Zollner, did you want to address this too?
Yeah, I had originally raised my hand for something else, but I'll have to remember what that is later.
Okay.
So yeah, on this topic, I've had a chance with like our engineering teams here at Microsoft. This was requested during the July IETF 114 SCIM session, and in a hypothetical world where we did build a SCIM service provider, as currently we only have a client. If we did build a service provider, we would, with pretty, it would be more likely than not that we would prefer to use and actually would want to require cursor-based pagination, which is a separate problem, actually. Hey, that's the other thing I originally raised my hand for, which is, I guess, long-term, I think Matt and I would like to find a way for a service provider to, let's say, only support cursor-based pagination for precisely that denial of service type reason that was originally brought up surrounding index-based pagination. But so to get back to the original question that we're still on, if Microsoft can massive Azure directory, big directory, if we were to implement a SCIM server, it seems today, based off of the research that we've done, that we would want to go with a cursor-based pagination model and actually require it to make sure that we never had to serve up results beyond a certain amount.
Okay, thanks. Pamela, did you have something?
Yes, and on the same topic. So, I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that we are architecting an interface, not an implementation, right? So I think you can go either side and say that there are ways to DDoS both sides. There are ways to run out of memory on both sides, right? But at least for now, while we have a default method, and all we're trying to do, I think, is add a second option that could allow, with the goal of allowing people, in fact, to offer, things that work better for their particular implementation, right? Like we're just talking about interfaces that can be, maybe lighter weight alternatives in certain use cases. I mean, is that right? Have I got that wrong?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we just needed to be able to have a way to have an interoperable implementation that that we could even expose. We just found like if we had an underlying application that used cursor pagination in its API or database, we could not create a SCIM service provider for that application unless we had some way of doing cursor pagination. And so rather than just leave that application out of our library of things that we offered for SCIM, we had to come up with something, because implementing a service provider that translated between cursor and index pagination, it wasn't possible with the resources that we would have available in the SCIM service provider. So that's why we proposed the draft, was so that we could have we would at least tell the world, here's what we did, right? And we feel like it might be useful for others. And I don't know how many people have implemented the draft, but it's been more than just us. So there's been other interest for it.
It would be useful for others to come forward, or if Matt, who other.
Well, I know that WSO2 implemented it because they were the last ones to comment on the mailing list that they had implemented it. And I've had enough questions on the mailing list to make me think that others have implemented it. I just don't have their email domains on hand right now to know which companies they came from. Yeah. There's been interest though.
I would also be particularly interested in hearing if someone's implemented it, the cursor pagination, without using the underlying cursors in a database. Do you know of any of those?
I don't. I mean,
Okay.
some databases
I think
support, databases support both index and cursor. There's databases that support just cursor and databases that just support index. And I think that, you would most likely just follow the underlying database strategy in your SCIM implementation.
Well, my implementation, I didn't. So.
Well, in your implementation, was your database?
But we didn't have 1,000 users either in the.
Okay.
So it wasn't as bad, but looking ahead to trying to deal with 100,000 users is a big chore to try and figure out what the best strategy is.
a quick time check here. We are ahead of schedule. We have 2 more topics left. So I do want to make sure we get to those, but if there is any more discussion here, we can spend another 5 minutes or so on this topic.
If not, we'll submit the draft, the new revision. It's very similar to the old one, and just watch for people to comment on the mailing list. Just happy to have any feedback that we can get that would result in more interoperability. And just I guess in closing, if and this is also to the discussion that Phil and I have had in the past, I can understand an argument possibly that would say we don't need pagination at all in SCIM, and that we can rely on max results and other mechanisms by which pagination just isn't even necessary. You just if you have a query that results in a large result set, you get all of the results up to max result, and there's just never any pagination. The concern that I had was that if index pagination is required, which it is in the current spec, that makes it difficult for people to create SCIM implementations, and just the adoption of SCIM might be affected by that. So I guess it really boils down to me is if we're going to have pagination in SCIM, I think we need to address cursor and index. If we're not going to have pagination at all, then we need to make that change in the spec.
I think, Matt, you need to explain why cursor pagination is better than a simple get. Because max results is an issue either way. If you can get the service provider to waive your max results so you can download the entire data set, which is your use case, whether you download it via cursor or whether you download it in one shot, it's the same thing. So
right, I'm not arguing
against just do a get.
You
and
just do
the argument I heard against that was I don't have the memory in my client to deal with that. Well, that's why you have a disk. So stream it to disk. That's really easy for service providers to implement, and it's super universal. It also supports bootstrap cases and all the other cases you want to cover. Cursor-based paging means I'm going to take up to days that I need you to hold that cursor open. I mean, I ran into this with LDAP a lot of times where the clients we had the most trouble with were the ones that wanted state maintained for 3 or 4 days because their processor was too slow. That led to a number of lost. As soon as you have a network problem, as time goes by, as soon as you have a network problem or other reason, you lose that state, and then the client never actually completes a synchronization. So a number of problems open up. But if your use case is, I want cursor-based pagination because it's better for the server for 1,000 results or yes, then I would support the spec. But if you're saying I want to be able to download the entire data set, I don't think this is the correct tool. And events has got the same issue. You don't download the entire data set with events. You can't. But there is a need now and then for people to be able to do an export and import en masse, and that's more the scenario I think you're coming after. Cursor, if as a consultant, paging seems to be the simplest way given no other options available. But if we're here at the standards community, we're talking about not an open source approach, which those who want to participate can participate. There is a bit of an implication, even though it'll always be optional, that cursor-based paging be supported if we say so. There'll be a lot of pressure to support it, and that really changes how people are going to implement the data systems underneath SCIM. I think it's just difficult for everybody. I do think one important concession that was helpful to me that you made was index-based paging versus cursor-based paging. Those observations make sense to me because it's the index-based paging and holding state on all of that entire index that's the problem. I would agree a cursor-based paging only will make it more doable, but then I keep coming back to why not just download it all at once?
Right.
It
Well,
makes it less of a threat.
Yeah, I know we're out of time, but I think it's in our implementations, it's more the fact that index-based pagination is not optional in the spec.
Well, yeah, we can
So
talk
if I
about that
want
as
yeah,
a 2.x.
so if I want to implement pagination at all, I have to implement some form of pagination in order to be interoperable. And if I am going to implement pagination in order to be interoperable, I need to be able to follow the pagination strategy of the existing code base, like Danny was mentioning. Like if you're going to put a SCIM interface in front of Azure Active Directory and you talk to the engineering team and they're like, we would prefer cursors, that conversation is being had all over. Anytime anybody's thinking about, do I create a SCIM implementation? These questions come up for the engineers and they have a really strong preference. And that was our case. So we either had the choice.
You're talking about a breaking change.
Well, that's why we tried to author the draft the way that we did, is we did not want to create a breaking change that would say, look, you don't have to implement pagination at all, and that's our choice. We tried to add something that would be able to allow interoperable cursor pagination without affecting index pagination, and that's the way that the draft reads. The proposal that Danny mentioned earlier, which is having a server only be able to support cursor pagination, we haven't actually written that into the draft because I'm concerned about that being a breaking change, but it would be really nice to be able to say, as a server, I only support pagination and it's cursor pagination.
Yeah. That'd be a whole new protocol, basically, unfortunately.
Yeah. So that's why the draft's written the way that it is, because it's not breaking. It makes cursor pagination optional. But I still think it's difficult for some service providers to implement index pagination, which is required.
I want to keep us moving on the agenda. Do we have any action items on this topic before we wrap it up?
The only action item that I think we propose is that we would resubmit the draft with revisions I mentioned earlier that eliminate the ambiguity, and that will put a draft in our library that's actually valid. The old one is several years old, This updates that and I think puts it on the docket for further discussion if we need it.
Okay, great. I'm looking at the agenda again. I made a mistake. This is my fault. I skipped over one of them, or misread one of them. So we are now a little bit behind schedule. Sorry. Philip, can we give you 18 minutes instead of 20, and then we can give Daniel the rest of the time between
Oh,
us
no,
two,
that-
and I'll just have to go a little bit quick on those.
That's fine. I don't need that much time at all, so I think we'll be on schedule
Great.
shortly. We'll be way ahead. There
Okay,
hasn't
in
been
that
much.
case, yeah, just for the minutes, make sure we are now on the SCIM profile for security event tokens.
Yeah, so there's been an update to the draft. Not much has changed. I removed a lot of the discussion about Kafka and message bus systems, but I think there's enough still left in there as an example. I think in reality, a service provider domain and a client domain will have their own event or bus-based systems that are likely happening, or you're going to have like a master-slave replication hierarchy. The spec doesn't say how you do that, but that's sort of acknowledging the reality that you may have hundreds of servers out there in one domain, and then in a client domain, again, you have an unknown set of infrastructure. So the objective with SCIM events is to say, we need to, across those administrative boundaries, we need to be able to share change events from SCIM and security events from SCIM across. So there is a mechanism that's been defined by the security event specs for either doing that physical transfer by push or by polling, long polling, that allows events to be delivered in real time. And the assumption then is that essentially there's a single gateway between domains communicating those events. And then once that event crosses into the receiving domain, some kind of system processes that event and then decides whether it gets sent to a provisioning manager or some other system that reconciles what to do inside the domain. So for example, if we had Salesforce as one issuing events back to Microsoft Azure, Salesforce doesn't need to know anything about what's going on in Azure at all. It's up to Azure inside of its domain. So this is all hypothetical. To reconcile that change, decide what to do about it, can go back to Salesforce for more information, and then can decide the parallel request there. So all that to set up, Danny sent out an email saying there's no recovery mechanism in SCIM events. Well, that's part of by design that there shouldn't need to be one. The recovery mechanism that is in set transfer methods is short-term recovery to deal with failures in the delivery mechanism so that data integrity is maintained. What is supposed to happen is that the event receiver, if they need a recovery mechanism in a long-term system, can maintain that themselves using whatever architecture they choose to do that. So if you were using Kafka as a message bus and you drop those events, and once you drop that event successfully and it's confirmed, received, or placed on the bus, then you can acknowledge back in set event transfer that I have successfully received the event. So now recovery is not an issue. That bus locally on the receiver side then can be used to bootstrap new servers. You can go back anytime, and so the change log becomes yours. So that was the design for recovery, is that the recovery is under the complete control of the client, and they can do whatever they want to do. They can make this simple, or they can make this based on a huge infrastructure. It can go either way. The other reason for doing this is that once you move from 50,000 entries up to 500,000 or 500 million entries, having a centralized changelog style mechanism becomes harder and harder to do, just the same way that doing a cursor across that many entities becomes harder and harder to do. So the idea is that now you have hundreds of servers, each accepting and processing changes. What are they going to do with those changes? They'll probably drop it onto a message bus of some kind, and then some router system picks up those changes and republishes them to all the clients that are registered to receive events. So this is what's envisioned by the shared signals event framework put out by OpenID, not just for security events, but also we can use it for provisioning events. And that's how this is all supposed to come together. When we went through this on the security event side, we realized that to maintain a change log on the service provider side, or an aggregated recovery mechanism for every possible client would blow up quickly, because you end up with a permutation and combination problem, because you're maintaining speculative copies for each security entity that may maintain it. So not only do you have 500 million entries in your database, you have every change event for all those 500 million times every single client that you've got. It won't work. So the idea is that the recovery mechanism for events is up to the receiver to decide to implement. If the receiver needs a recovery mechanism that's long-term, they can build that to whatever mechanism and architecture they choose to use. So they could do their own LDAP-ish changelog on their side. There's nothing saying you can't do that. And you can fit your own master replication or whatever strategy you have, you can do whatever you want. So the idea is that SCIM events fit in with the shared signals framework so that it's not layering any additional things. And then SCIM event is just then a schema definition. We're not inventing any new protocol here. There's implementations out there. So that's really all the update that I have. And we've talked a lot about that in my responses to Matt's question. And one of the things that I still envision is you still are going to have use cases that neither paging addresses nor SCIM events addresses, which are, how do I bootstrap a new SCIM replica or a new copy? How do I do this when the situations where I want a full copy of the entire data set? Is that something even the SCIM working group should work on or not? But I would argue neither draft solves this problem, nor should it. So there's that. The other thing is that this may seem complex, but this was the decision of the SCIM working group to move this out to the security events group, because all of these different standards groups were developing signals based on JOT tokens. And we wanted to have common processing, common abilities to transfer them and to do things all the same way. It gives the appearance that it's a big, huge thing that you have to implement, but really it's a shared system, shared set of specs, which means there's already implementations available for you to use. So the work I'm doing right now in reality is to implement this using the OpenID shared signals framework, particularly the one Cisco Duo developed. And so that's going on, and I've had some feedback for the shared signals group because there's some unnecessary restrictions, but that's really just about it. So I can turn over the rest of the time to questions or for other things.
Go ahead, Wenting.
I do have a question. My understanding is SCIM is really for identities. There are different identities translated into profiles. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I just wonder, like, in terms of security event scope, does it only covers profiles for the identities, or it also covers account management, login sessions, and other events, which looks like I'm not sure if it's in the scope of the user profiles. So that's probably my first question, because just try to understand the scope of the events itself. The second
So-
question I have is, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Just to answer that, it's not for different resource types. It matches SCIM events, matches the SCIM protocol essentially. So if you do a create event, if you do a create in SCIM, there's an analogous create event in the event architecture. So it is not specific to any kind of resource type at all. So and then you can decide which types of objects you're issuing events for. That would be up to the parties to negotiate.
Okay. The second part is that I just want whether event itself include fields which have strong data types, or it's just a matter of string, or all of them are strings, or the data type is implied.
That would depend on the event definition itself. If you look at the original RFC, I think it's 8417 for security event token, it gives an example of a password reset event. And I've mentioned that in the new SCIM events draft, but the idea there was that, first of all, password reset is I'll call it a higher level event. There are SCIM events that match the SCIM protocol, create, patch, put, delete, and so forth. But the security event for password reset event is simply saying Phil Hunt reset this object, which is Phil Hunt, reset his password. And in the example, it shows that you could also have down the way, or if you're in a local relationship, you could add extended data that says he's reset his password now 4 times, because that might be additional information. The spec it all depends on what we put in the event as to what specific data can go in, but at the moment, the spec just simply specifies SCIM data and what event goes. There's 2 versions of right now for the protocol events, like a create event. In one version, you're sharing all the raw data, which is presumably being used for security partners that are tightly related, and they're essentially doing replication. And then there's another one which shares no data at all. It just simply says this object changed. And then it's up to the receiver to go back and pull that object so that it can reconcile the changes that occurred. And it also allows access controls to flow, to work, and things like that. So if you read the spec, it either is, there's 2 different versions where you're passing all of the data or you're passing almost none of the data. And either way it can work. And if you look at the security events, which are higher level events, it shows you how you can pass standardized claims as well as additional claims that you might say, well, in our deployment, we need to know the password reset count, so we're going to add this additional data. And you could devise any other information you want to exchange. There's no limit there. It's just a matter of how much you want it standardized. It's similar in the sense that in SCIM, there is the user object, there's the group object, there's the enterprise user object, and people often do their own extensions locally, and that's fine. It's all a question of, do you want to register that with IANA, and how much you want to formalize these new attributes. So it all works essentially the same way.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, if you don't mind, Phil, I'd like to close this topic and move on to the last 2.
Sounds good.
Great, thank you. So, Danny Zollner, you've got the rest of the 15 minutes of the session for your 2 drafts. Sorry for cutting them a little bit short.
No worries. I think I can still run under time probably.
Great.
So yeah, the roles and entitlements draft back at IETF 14. I wrote a revision to the draft. I emailed about it to the working group mailing list. I've gotten a bit of feedback. Just, I guess I'll start off with a reminder. Anybody who might potentially be interested in a way to retrieve roles and like the list of acceptable values, please go review it and provide feedback. I'm gonna work with the chairs to put this up for a call for adoption at some point in the next couple of weeks, probably. I guess so. I'll start. There's like I can list off the updates, but I think I also did that via email. Does anybody have any thoughts on the draft? Any comments, concerns, suggestions? One thing.
This is the entitlement draft, right?
Yes, the roles and entitlements draft.
Yeah, that particular one, I do have a question in terms of the scope of the problem we try to address, because usually a user's or assumptions, the user's entitlement or like roles, it's probably limited. Different downstream systems might have different roles or entitlements and the permission hierarchies. So I just wonder, in this particular case, given that the directories or identities usually is centralized, it's in some cases centralized where they have a lot of downstream systems. So I just wonder, like a single attribute might not be the same or applicable to all the systems, all the downstream systems the directory is integrated with. I just wonder, in this particular case, is a spec try, or at least the proposed try to address that particular problem, or it have a different assumption here?
So I didn't really think about I guess systems where like the SCIM API is built on top of multiple like I guess distributed and somewhat disconnected systems. The problem that I was trying to address with the draft is that with both the roles and entitlements attributes on a user resource, typically there are a finite set of acceptable values for those. The values are already predetermined somewhere based on what roles or entitlements exist in the system. So you can't just provide a value for a role of anything, any possible character combination. It would usually get rejected in a lot of at least the fast SCIM implementations I've seen. And so in that case, there's I would classify it as an interoperability problem, where if a SCIM client and a SCIM service provider are sort of becoming acquainted for the first time and trying to work with each other, if the SCIM client wants to sort of increase its chances of making successful requests, so that is formulating the body of a request to create or update a user and to provide them with roles or entitlements in that external system. Currently, there's no way inside of the standard for anything acting as a SCIM client to retrieve a list of the acceptable values for roles or entitlements. And almost any implementer is going to document this somewhere. So whoever develops the SCIM client could in turn go and like do manual work and like read a piece of documentation and then write code to add them to a list somewhere. But that's obviously not a scalable solution. So the goal here was entirely to allow without human intervention. You can go and then connect a SCIM client to 100 different SCIM service provider implementations that have implemented some varying list of roles and entitlements, or roles and or entitlements, and allow the SCIM client to know via the standard what are the possible acceptable values for these attributes. That way requests are not built with disallowed values. And the SCIM spec has a caveat in it where the SCIM service provider can sort of partially accept a request from a SCIM client, and any attributes that it chooses, the SCIM service provider can just drop them. So conceivably, that's actually a thing that the SCIM service provider could do, of just, oh hey, you gave me a wrong a role that I don't have, so I'm going to ignore it. In practice, in the SaaS world, there's a lot of service provider implementations where if you provide a value that is not part of the predefined list of values for that application, the request will get rejected, which is sort of wasted computational and network energy and all that of trying to make a request that fails. And so that is the goal. So I think to answer your question of like all the downstream systems, that's probably on the SCIM service provider implementer to build something, whether it's manually writing a list or an internal thing that queries all the different sources to be able to show that. Because if the SCIM service provider is only going to accept a finite set of values, those values have to be defined somewhere already. So this is really just surface those values that you're already restricting on somewhere else.
So, I think in terms of scope of the problem try to address it, I would think this is more like coarse grain level, account level roles and entitlements. So it's not going to address the permissions or entitlements for the granular resources within a particular like scheme service provider.
Yeah, so this is, I think, sort of a fundamental question, and it's an area that's maybe a little ill-defined, at least in practice, inside of the standard, which is like, I guess good examples are good, like use cases behind the roles and entitlements attributes. Typically, what I've seen, anecdotally from my experience, is that roles tend to be those high-level, coarse set of permissions rather than fine-grained. Entitlements, I haven't seen implemented as much as roles. Some of the few times I've seen, it's typically been used more in the vein of like license assignment or like feature assignments inside of an application. I think conceivably entitlements could also be used in that same way for a finer grained set of permissions. There may also be justification behind a third set of a third attribute covering roughly the same purpose of permissions versus entitlements versus roles. But with the two today, they're not, in my experience, particularly well defined or well understood. So I think that's more a problem for the spec rather than for specifically my draft, which is more about discoverability of the values that are allowed.
Thank you.
Any other questions on that question? Actually served as a really good, got a whole lot of thoughts out there. So thank you, Wenting. If not, I'll move on to the referential values thing, which shouldn't take that long. Okay. So yeah, I'm not actually sure if I ever emailed this one to the mailing list. If not, I'll go check and make sure that I do mail it. So I wrote this draft, back during IETF 114 as well. The idea had been floating around for a while. So in a nutshell, it's trying to solve that same set of problems that I was just talking about with the roles and entitlements things of how can a SCIM client be well informed enough to sort of increase its rate of successful requests. So, knowing all of the intricacies of what is and is not allowed with the SCIM service provider's implementation. So this referential value location, not to be confused with reference attributes. It has to do with, so if we use like the manager attribute, for an example, in the core user schema, it's defined inside of a paragraph somewhere in the schema spec that the value for like manager.value should be the ID value of another user in the directory. Programmatically, there's no way to determine that. And the problem is that there's other attributes besides manager that people will implement, and they may be custom attributes, their own schema extensions. It may be I don't know, things like job title, or potentially role even would work here as well, actually. But there may be a predefined list somewhere of for this attribute we will only accept this set of values. So cost center, I think the enterprise user cost center is probably a really good example as well. So the problem is that if there's a finite set of acceptable values for an attribute, and those are defined somewhere, that it's really helpful for the SCIM client if it can go and discover this somewhere. So this draft is written essentially, it has a couple of new sub attributes or attributes to the actual like schema or the schema definition. So like the properties that make up the schema definition of an attribute. And those are to say, yes, yes or no, true or false. This attribute is the values are restricted based on a list that is defined somewhere else. And then there's two sub attributes that tell you the resource type that houses those attributes, or rather those values, and the attribute, or like the schema URI for the attribute where those values to be present. So you could, using like the manager as an example for users, it would say, well, for the manager attribute, this value is sort of constrained by a value on the user resource that exists at and then just give the URI for the core schema ID value, which is actually a common attribute. Whatever, we get into weird edge case stuff, but I've seen ample use for this in some of the SCIM implementations that I've had to work with, and I think from a discoverability standpoint, this would be really helpful, sort of at scale, to help solve problems and be more efficient. There's yeah. So I'll make sure I email the. No, excuse me, talking too much. I'll make sure I email the mailing list if I haven't already on this one, which I'm suspecting that I never got around to it. And please share your feedback to anybody. I yield my time.
Great, thanks. We only have a couple of minutes left, so let's, I guess, wrap this up. For everybody who's got in progress draft, I'd love to get those posted, and then we will continue the discussion on the mailing list. I did already submit the request for a session for IETF-115, which is in London, and there will be remote options, of course, available to join remotely if you can't make it there. So that'll be the next time we get together to talk in person. And yeah, thanks, Joel, for taking fantastic notes from the session. So yeah, any closing thoughts from anybody else? Great. In that case, oh, Nancy's here.
I was just going to say thank you, Aaron, for running most of this today.
Of course, happy to. Hopefully next time I'll do a little better keeping track of the time.
Well, and hopefully I will be healthy enough to help too.
All right, in that case, we will give you all 90 seconds back. And thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.